Welcome to the Craft Yarn Council's Stitch Away Stress interview series. I'm Mary Colucci, past Executive Director of the Council. Today I'm delighted to welcome Carol Caparosa, founder of Project Knitwell, a nonprofit organization that has been instrumental in introducing therapeutic knitting to hospitals and community centers in the Washington, D.C. area. Welcome, Carol, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mary, for having me. Happy to be able to talk to you about this.
Well, we don't get an opportunity to talk enough, but I know for many of our listeners, they might not know a little bit about the background of Project Knitwell and how it was started. So if you could just briefly share a little bit of your experiences.
Sure. Project Knitwell started as a nonprofit in 2010, but the idea for Project Knitwell really came many years before that. It came in 1990 when I had the experience of being the mother of a pediatric patient. My daughter, who is now just turned 28, she was born in 1990 and at 7 days old diagnosed with multiple congenital heart defects. So she spent numerous weeks, especially her first year of life, at MedStar Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C. And I spent all my time at the hospital, too. And what I realized there that I had a very hard time concentrating. I was very good at worrying, but very not so good at concentrating or focusing. I used to think that there was something wrong with all the clocks at Georgetown Hospital because they never seemed to move. And I had been a knitter, but I had not knit in a very long time. And someone gave me a hand knit sweater as a gift for Emily. And I remember looking at that sweater and thinking that that was what I was going to do while I was waiting in the hospital. And this was 1990, so we weren't using internet. There were no caring bridges. There weren't people in waiting rooms, surgical liaisons who were coming up and telling you how the surgery was going. So there was an awful lot of long hours of just waiting. So the next time I went back home, because once you're a knitter, you always have a bit of a stash, I dug through and found some yarn and needles, and I really knit my way through the rest of her hospital stays. And I've done that each time she's had a procedure. Even just within this past year, she had a procedure. And even though I can come equipped with books and music and Sudoku puzzles and all those kinds of things, the only thing I can really do is knit. And so what happened then after she was about 15 years old, I went back to Georgetown to be a volunteer. And I went back to the pediatric unit, and I told the child life specialist that I'd be happy to teach moms to knit in addition to the other things that they would have us do. And really it just took off. We had a group of 4 women right off the bat, and then it just grew from working primarily with parents to then we work with patients. And the patients, we go right into their rooms. Sometimes we have to gown up. You might have a mask and a gown and gloves on, but still able to teach knitting. And then we've also worked with staff there. And then from Georgetown, it's just grown to, we've worked in over 20 sites in the D.C. area, and from hospitals to also community centers.
Oh, that's amazing. Now, was the initial offer that you made at Georgetown MedStar, how did they respond when you said knitting? Was there some eye rolling or just questioning, or did
no? They were accepting of it right off the bat at Georgetown. I think because they're always looking for activities for the families to do. Mm-hmm. And the child life specialists have told us that one thing that they like about the knitting project is that it often can get the parents especially out of the room and meeting other parents. So they see it as a social activity for the parents also, because many times parents don't leave the room, but they would leave the room for, getting together for knitting. They also see it as something that can be done whether you speak English or not, because, it's so visual for teaching that we've worked with many people who do not have English as their first language. Some that sometimes we've needed interpreters, And they do have a phone system in most of the patients' rooms where you can get an interpreter by phone. But often we've been able to do it just by showing them visually and working our way through it. I have used some other moms, especially Spanish-speaking moms, who have helped me with some of the other moms. But so it's no, they were very accepting of it. Yeah.
Well, having spent just one day at the hospital, and I understand how I think forward-thinking they are in providing an atmosphere for patients and families to help them deal with those many hours of waiting around or difficult tests or a whole variety of problems that they might face.
Right. And the other thing that Georgetown did, we were lucky enough to be a part of a research study very early on when Project Knitwell started, with two nurses who were oncology nurses on the adult floor, and they were getting their master's degree and wanted to study if knitting would be a good intervention to reduce compassion fatigue, which is a word for burnout that they use in the medical community. And so we taught about 25 different nurses. And what they learned from that study, which was published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, what they learned from that study is, yes, knitting did help those who learned to knit reduce their compassion fatigue. And they also learned who had the most compassion fatigue, and one of those types were the younger nurses, younger in age, and also the ones that had the least amount of experience. So what Georgetown did, they kind of took it a step further, and they created then monthly knitting session for nursing staff. And then they also would invite us to come and speak and teach the new nurses who were coming on into the hospital. They have maybe about 70 some nurses twice a year that begin to work there, and they go through this whole what they call residency program to last a year. And one of the things, so they're constantly going to workshops and things, and one of them was on self-care, and that's what we were a part of. So they, I think, recognized that this was helpful, and so we're trying to offer it to more people. We have a knitting basket in the nurses' lounge, in several of the nurses' lounges, where the nurses, when they're taking a little break, if they want to knit, they can.
Now, how did you engage other people in this effort, other volunteers?
At the beginning, it was really a couple of friends of mine, to be honest, or it was friends of friends, people who had recently retired, who are knitters and wanted to do something with the knitting and liked the idea of volunteering in a hospital. And then we've also recruited many of our volunteers from the hospitals themselves. They're volunteers who've already been working in the hospital. They are knitters, and they would see our volunteers coming, so then they wanted to get involved. We offer 3 times a year, I think it is, what we call volunteer information sessions. So people who have heard about us, who write to us and want to get involved, we invite them to an orientation session, tell them about Project Knitwell, and tell them about the kinds of volunteer opportunities that we have. Because we have about 40 volunteers, and we use volunteers for instructors, being volunteer knitting instructors, and they all go through a series of training on how you teach knitting, because we want all of our volunteers to teach knitting in the same way. Kind of like if you went to Starbucks and you ordered a latte, you want it to be the same in Pittsburgh as you're getting in DC. So because sometimes our volunteers overlap, and I might work with someone that another volunteer had already worked with. So we want to all be teaching on the same page. So they all go through that training experience. But we also have volunteers who make up our starter kits. We have volunteers who make up our samples. We have volunteers who help us with PR, that kind of thing. So sure. I think it's through word of mouth, but also as it's grown and more people have heard about it, people write to us and want to be involved.
As part of our series, we had an opportunity to speak with Betson Corkle, and I know that she was invited by you to give a lecture to many of your volunteers, and I had a chance, to see a portion of that. But that must have been very exciting to hear the more medical reasons behind, the whole process of knitting.
Yeah, it was thrilling to be able to have her. I mean, I've been reading about Betsy for years since Project Knitwell started. So to actually be able to meet her in person, and she's always been so responsive too. Whenever one time I had a patient referred to me who was legally blind, and I hadn't really ever worked with a patient who was legally blind, and I emailed Betson, and she gave me some good advice on it, like having the knitting needles be a little larger, or alternating maybe darker needles with the lighter yarn so that there'd be some contrast. I've also had a friend who had a family member at Parkinson's, and I wrote to Betson about that. So she's really a tremendous resource in this whole area. So it was great to have her there. And we actually had two things. We had the lecture at Georgetown Hospital, and very well attended. And it was some of our volunteers, but many people from the hospital and university were there who were interested in, the subject of how you could knit a healthy brain, I think was what our poster said, which was exactly what she talked about, and using knitting for different reasons, whether you want to increase your focus and concentration, then you can pick one kind of pattern. If you want to just really relax and de-stress, you would obviously pick a different kind of pattern. And then the next day, she did an all-day workshop for our volunteers and some other artists who work at the Lombardi Arts and Center department at Georgetown, and wealth of information. So that was, our volunteers just raved about it, how good it was and relevant, and they asked specific questions relating to people that they see, and just very helpful. It's so nice to have that connection.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned starter kits. So these are kits that you provide your volunteers?
Yeah, every person that we teach to knit gets a starter kit, and it's very simple. It's just a size 8 bamboo needles, light colored worsted weight yarn, and we cast on about 16 stitches, and we knit about 3 or 4 rows. So when we teach knitting to a beginner, we already have it cast on, and we have a little bit started. Mm-hmm. After they learn to knit the garter stitch, then we move them on to a project that, again, is just garter stitch. And it might be a simple hat or fingerless gloves or a scarf. And then if they're interested in cast on, we would teach them the cast on. And we use the knitted cast on only because it's so similar to the knitting that they're just adding 2 steps, and never met anyone that didn't actually get it. Whereas to try to teach the long tail and the other kinds, it's a different skill set. So we all know that knitting does, reduce stress. Those of us are knitters, but I always tell people I work with initially that, until you learn it has an element of making you stressed out. And so our job at Project Knitwell, these people are already in very stressful situations. So our job is to take the stress out of it. So we keep our patterns simple. We don't try to have 10,000 options. And we hope people will accomplish and finish a project. But I've recognized that some people are much more process knitters, and they like to just knit and are not really concerned if they finish it. Others, the feeling of accomplishment is what drives them, and they just want to go on to make the next thing and the next thing. And eventually, depending on how long we work with people, we often teach people then how to purl and do stockinette and rib and have their patterns then be a little more advanced. Because some of the moms we work with in the NICU might be there for 6 months. So we work with moms who have made socks, sweaters, etc. That's not the majority, but we will do that,
Sure.
In a sequence. Yeah.
Well, I know that Lion Brand has been very supportive of Project Knitwell, And
Yeah.
I think they're contributing the yarn to the starter kits.
Yes, they donate a lot of yarn to us. Not all of our yarn, but a very good amount of yarn. And we use their yarn for our starter kits. We also they donated a lot of the Vanna White yarn. We've used a lot of that with our moms in the NICU who are making things for their babies. They've donated a lot of the chunky woolies. Trying to think of some of the other labels, but a lot of the more bulky for cow neck scarves. So they've been very generous, and we're very appreciative of that, having that relationship.
Yeah, and I know that they also worked with you to produce the Project Knitwell Presents the Comfort of Knitting, which is a wonderful booklet.
Yeah, I think that is such a great booklet and unique because it's the only book I know of that combines both knitting instruction, knitting patterns, and the reasons why people knit. I mean, there's a lot of books out there on how to knit, and there's obviously a lot of pattern books. And then there are books that are talk about the therapeutic benefits. But this kind of in a very small, simple way has all of those three areas. And it also focuses on the caregiver, which being in the hospital, all the moms we work with are obviously caregivers. The staff are caregivers, siblings, family members. There's so many caregivers. So this zeroes in on the caregivers, which I think is unique too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Now, you have two other resource booklets that I think we certainly want to point out to our listeners. One is the Resource Guide for Young Knitters, which is the actual booklet that you might leave with.
Yes,
younger
all
patient.
of our young people that we work with, and we're even giving it now to some of our adult people that we work with. And this year we are probably going to redo that and might make it into the resource guide for the knitter, for the new knitter, instead of making it just for the young knitter.
That's right.
But it was originally funded by the Ronald McDonald Charities of Washington, D.C. And, they have a mandate that they provide funds for people who are, I think it's just up to the age of 18. So this guide was designed specifically for young people in mind. Mm-hmm. And another thing I think is great about about this booklet is that I met a young woman, her name is Julia, at Georgetown. She was admitted very often, and she was a fantastic knitter. And so we would knit together a lot, and I'd give her different materials and patterns, but she often had her own too. And so she helped us write that book because we wanted, since it was a book for young people, we wanted input from a young person. And I think when I first met her, she might have been around 15, 16. Last time I talked with her, I think she was a junior in college. So a lot of it is her work. Why a teenager would think knitting would be fun. And the graphics are fun. We have a list of celebrities that knit. We have pictures of dogs with knitted scarves. So it's fun. And we have resources for youth. So we're hoping to broaden it a little bit and combine it with youth and some adults resources and information. But we also have a whole group of patterns and instruction. So it's fun. It's a fun book, and it looks fun.
And we will have the website and links to all of these leaflets and booklets.
Yeah,
and then the last one I wanted to mention was establishing a pediatric knitting program for patients and family members in a hospital setting, which is for perhaps people who might be interested in developing a similar program.
Yeah, I would say monthly we get several requests from people throughout the country, some even in other countries than the United States, asking us if we have Project Knitwell chapters or if we could help them start a program in another state. We don't have chapters at this point. We do talk about that, but our resources are limited right now, and we are focusing just in the Metro DC area right now. But that might be something in the future. But we did do a guidebook, again, funded by Ronald McDonald that early on, about how you could replicate it if you wanted to. It's geared towards starting a program in a hospital on a pediatric floor, but many of the suggestions and tips that are in there translate to other units or other populations. So many people request that, and we're happy to send it. It's a electronic version. That's not a bound or anything. It's just electronic, and we send that.
That's great.
But beside our most recent sites that we've just taken on that are a little bit different, I think, or we're working with a group of people that either are currently struggling with homelessness or were formerly homeless. And there's a place in D.C. called Street Sense that helps these individuals. And they write magazines. They write articles for newspapers and sell them on the streets. And so we're doing a weekly program with the people that are involved with Street Sense. And then just recently in Virginia, we're working now in a kind of like a group home setting for women who have just come out of prison. And so we're doing I think it's every week there also. And then in a couple of schools with some of the students identified with special needs. So although we got our start in hospitals and it's that needed in hospitals, we also find that it definitely can be replicated with other kinds of community settings.
Exactly. Well, I know you continue to be very active on the board of Project Knitwell, but you had the good fortune of finding Michelle Maynard to also assume the position of executive director for Project Knitwell.
Right. Michelle's terrific, and she's someone that had just heard about it through somewhere, contacted me. We got together. She was doing something at one of the local hospitals, and so that became one of our sites through her. And she has a lot of skills in managing and nonprofits, so I saw that as a wonderful way to have her become involved. She's wonderful because as I became more involved in the administration part, I missed the direct service part. I missed going into Georgetown and teaching. So I still do that. I weekly volunteer at Georgetown in the pediatric and the NICU mostly. And then if we get referrals throughout the hospital, we can go. So I like serving on the board and doing special projects, but I want to also be a volunteer. So Michelle is part-time, but does a tremendous amount to move the organization forward.
Absolutely. We've had a chance to work with her, and it's been a real pleasure. But to wrap things up today, you've had so many opportunities to work with people, not only in the hospital settings, but in people dealing with everyday stresses of life and family and work. What are some perhaps tips you can offer to people about how to integrate knitting or crochet into their lives to help eliminate some of those stress?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is taking it slowly, showing them the kinds of simple projects that they can make so that they can get a little bit excited when they see like a little baby hat or a scarf that they can make. So taking it slowly. I think we have a good way of teaching people. It's rare that someone doesn't actually learn how to knit after we've worked with them. They may decide that it's not something they want to do, but they generally they learn it. I think the other thing I always emphasize is that this is to help them. So if there's a time where they're feeling like stressed out or this isn't working or they're making a lot of mistakes, to just take a pause from it. We exchange contact information. I'm there weekly. We have other volunteers that are there through the week too. Mm-hmm. So they can get help. There's ways to get help. also, when we're working with the nurses too, some of the nurses sometimes have been able to help them a little bit. But I try to explain that this is the last thing we want, that this would be an added stress, and that we recognize that some weeks they're able to knit more than other weeks, and that's okay. And that it's also okay if the knitting, just the actual process of it, is what you want to do. There's no kind of must. There's no, you have to finish this because then you're going on to the next thing. It's really what works for them. I think making it a creative experience also is good. I see some people, they're so interested in the colors and how they can match things together. And so I talk a lot about it also appealing to so many of the senses, like the touch, the visual, the colors, and that's all to be enjoyed.
Absolutely.
That's all part of it, not just the finished product. But I must say, people are so proud of themselves when they finish the first project. Yeah.
Oh, Carol, that's really important to share. And thank you so much for taking the time today, to give us a little of background and also talking about, the growth of Project Knitwell and going beyond the hospital settings. It's been very informative. So we thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it, Mary.
Okay.
Thank you.
And stitch away stress, Carol.
Yeah, okay, I will. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.